Last time we spoke about Japan's preparations for war. In late 1936, tensions soared in China as Nationalist Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was detained by dissenting commanders who were frustrated with his focus on communism instead of the growing Japanese threat. Faced with escalating Japanese aggression, these leaders forced Chiang Kai-shek into a reluctant alliance with the Chinese Communist Party, marking a pivotal moment in China's strategy. Despite this union, China remained unprepared, lacking sufficient military supplies and modern equipment. Conversely, Japan, wary of Chinese modernization efforts, pushed for a preemptive strike to dismantle Chiang's regime before it posed a serious threat. As aggressive military exercises intensified, Japan underestimated Chinese resilience. By spring of 1937, both nations found themselves on the brink of war, with Japan's divided military leadership struggling to formulate a coherent strategy. Ultimately, these miscalculations would lead to a full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War, altering the course of history in East Asia. This episode is the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. Well, hello there and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released an episode covering the defense of the Great Wall of China in 1933. And on Echoes of War, we just released an episode covering the Year of the Four Emperors. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And the latest exclusive podcast is on the government by assassination. That being Japan during the 1920s and 1930s, when young radical Japanese officers were killing just about any official to get their agenda put forward. So here we are at last, the beginning of the absolute cataclysm between China and Japan. Now, as many of you know, I run the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, which technically covers the Second Sino-Japanese War, but not nearly to a T. So for this podcast, I want to try and portray the event from the Chinese and Japanese point of view, but not in that rather dry manner of the other podcast. The other podcast, I'm hampered by the week-by-week format, and I can never really dig deep into the nitty-gritty, as they say. On the same hand, I don't want to simply regurgitate every single battle of this conflict, because we would be here for maybe 2 years. So bear with me, my friends, as we fall down this rabbit hole of madness together, and who knows how long it's going to take to get out. On the night of July the 7th, 1937, at approximately 7:30 p.m., the 8th Squadron of the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Regiment of the Hubeian Brigade of the Japanese Army, stationed in Fengtai, and led by Squadron Leader Shimizu Sero, conducted a military exercise heading towards Longwangmiao. That's approximately just under a mile northwest of the Marco Polo Bridge. The exercise simulated an operation to capture said bridge. As you may have guessed, said bridge was named after the Italian explorer Marco Polo, who described it in his travels. The bridge is renowned for its intricate carvings of lions and other sculptures. However, after 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge would be far less known for its history dealing with Venetian explorer, and more so with an event that many would contend to be involved with the start of World War II. At that time, troops from Japan, Britain, France, and Italy were stationed near Beiping in accordance with the Boxer Protocol of 1901. The Japanese China Garrison Army, comprising around 4,000 soldiers and commanded by Lieutenant General Tashiro Kanichiro, was based in Tianjin. Their mission was to maintain communication lines between Beiping and the seaports in the Gulf of Jiuli, and to protect Japanese citizens living in key areas of North China. The protocol also permitted the garrison forces of the signatory nations to conduct field drills and rifle practice without notifying Chinese authorities, with the exception of cases involving live fire. During this period, Japanese troops were conducting nightly exercises in anticipation of a scheduled review on July the 9th. The night maneuver was within the Army's rights under the Boxer Protocol and was not an illegal act, as later claimed by the Chinese. However, the Japanese Army had actually informed the Chinese authorities about its training plans in advance. Despite this, the atmosphere was charged with tension, and the Japanese decision to use blank ammunition during their night exercise further escalated the already volatile situation. Earlier that evening, Captain Shimizu Setsuro, a company commander, arrived at the banks of the Yongting River, where the maneuver was to take place. He noticed that the site looked different since the last exercise had occurred. Chinese troops had recently constructed new trenches and parapets from the embankment to the Langpang shelter. While eating his dinner and surveying the area, Shimizu felt a sense of unease, harboring a premonition that something might happen that night. After completing the first stage of the maneuver, around 10:30 p.m., several live rounds were fired into the assembled company from the direction of the riverbank. Shimizu immediately conducted a roll call and found one soldier was missing. He promptly sent a messenger to inform the battalion commander. The exercise was then called off, and the company moved eastwards to await further orders at Shiwulitsen. Battalion Commander Itsuki Kyonaho, upon receiving the report, deemed the situation quite serious. Aside from the gunfire heard in the darkness from an unknown source, he expressed concern over the soldier's disappearance and sought permission from Regimental Commander Mutaguchi Renya, yes, a absolute moron. If you listen to the Pacific War podcast, well, you know. Anyways, to relocate the battalion to an area where the shots had been fired and to establish surveillance. As dawn approached, the troops heard several more gunshots. Within 20 minutes of the soldier's disappearance, he returned to his ranks. But Shimizu did not report this update until about 4 hours later. Meanwhile, midnight negotiations included a Japanese request for permission to search the city of Wanping, leading both sides to believe the incident was significant. At around 11 p.m., the Japanese forces falsely reported that one of their soldiers had gone missing during the drill, and they demanded permission to enter the city for a search. This request was firmly denied by Ji Xingwen, the commander of the 219th Regiment of the 37th Division. In response, Japanese troops swiftly surrounded Wanping County. To prevent further escalation, at about 2 a.m. the following morning, Jin Du-chun, the deputy commander of the 29th Army and a mayor of Beiping, agreed with the Japanese to allow both sides to send personnel for an investigation. While Matsue, the head of the Japanese Secret Service in Beiping, was negotiating with North Chinese authorities based on unverified reports from Chinese troops in Fangcai, Ikikiano, the battalion commander of the Japanese garrison in Fangcai, had already reported to his regimental commander, Mutaguchi Renya, and this led to approved orders for the Japanese troops in Fangcai to immediately move out to the Marco Polo Bridge. On July the 8th, a large contingent of Japanese troops appeared at the bridge. Shen Zhongming, the platoon leader of the 10th Company of the Reserve Force of the 3rd Battalion of the 219th Regiment of the 37th Division of the 29th Army, was assisting in guarding the bridgehead. He jumped out of his trench, stood in front of the bunker, and raised his right hand to halt the advancing Japanese. However, the Japanese military threatened to search for their missing soldiers, pushed forward, and opened fire. Shen Zhongming was shot, and he died on the spot. At 4:50 a.m., the Japanese army launched a fierce assault on Wanping County, capturing Shagang in northeast of Wanping, and then firing the first shot of the siege. Unable to withstand the aggression, the Chinese defenders mounted a counterattack. That day, the Japanese army assaulted Wanping about 3 times, targeting the Pinghan Railway Bridge and the Chinese defenders at the Huilong Temple, which was positioned just to the left. He Jifeng, the commander of the 110th Brigade, issued a resolute order to, quote, "live and die with the bridge," and he personally commanded the frontline battle. The Chinese defenders engaged in fierce combat, fighting valiantly despite exhausting their ammunition and resorting to hand-to-hand combat with swords against the Japanese soldiers. Tragically, over 80 Chinese defenders from 2 platoons were killed at the bridgehead. That same day, the Beiping authorities instructed the garrison to hold firm at the Marco Polo Bridge. Song Jae-yuan sent a telegram to Chiang Kai-shek to report the true events of the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, as it became known. The Nationalist government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs launched a verbal protest with the Japanese ambassador regarding the incident. Additionally, the CCP Central Committee issued a telegram urging all Chinese soldiers and civilians to unite and resist Japanese aggression. The Japanese cabinet, in a bid to mislead global public opinion, proposed a so-called policy of resolving the incident locally without escalating it, aiming to paralyze the KMT authorities and buy time to mobilize additional forces. In the wake of the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, generals of the 29th Army, including Qin Duchan, Feng Jian, and Jiang Xuzhong, convened an emergency meeting. Following their discussions, they issued a statement demanding that their troops withdraw from the Marco Polo Bridge to de-escalate tensions. However, they expressed deep concerns about national sovereignty, stating, quote, "We cannot simply back down. If they continue to oppress us, we will do our utmost to defend ourselves." Concurrently, the 29th Army commanded the troops defending the Marco Polo Bridge to, quote, "The Marco Polo Bridge is your grave. You must live and die with the bridge, and you must not retreat." Brigade Commander Hu Jifang reinforced 3 directives for the defenders. Number 1. Do not allow the Japanese army to enter the city. Number 2. Firmly counterattack if the Japanese invade. Number 3. You are responsible for defending the territory and will never yield. If you abandon your position, you will face military law. On July the 9th, the 29th Army successfully eliminated a Japanese squadron and reclaimed control of the railway bridge at the Langpang Temple. A temporary lull settled over the Marco Polo Bridge battlefield, during which the Japanese military made false claims that missing Japanese soldiers had returned to their units, and described the situation as a mere misunderstanding that could be resolved peacefully. Subsequently, Chinese and Japanese representatives in Beiping and Tianjin engaged in negotiations. The Beiping authorities reached an agreement with the Japanese forces, which would include: Number 1. The immediate cessation of hostilities by both parties. Number 2. The Japanese army withdrawing to the left bank of the Yongting River, while the Chinese army retreated to the right bank. And number 3. The defense of the Longgu Bridge has been assigned to Shi Yusan's unit of the Hubei security team. However, the following day, while the Chinese army withdrew as agreed, the Japanese army not only failed to uphold its commitments, but also dispatched a significant number of troops to launch an offensive against the Chinese forces. Reports on July the 10th indicated that the Japanese army had arrived from Tianjin, Gubeikou, Yuguan, and other locations, advancing towards the Legao Bridge with artillery and tanks, and they had already occupied Dajing Village and Wudian, signaling that another outbreak of conflict seemed to be imminent. On July the 11th, the Japanese cabinet decided to deploy 7 divisions from the Kwangtung Army, the Korean Army, and Japan to North China. On that same day, the Beiping-Tianjin authorities reached a localized agreement with the Japanese army, which would entail: Number 1. A formal apology from a representative of the 29th Army to the Japanese forces, along with assurances that those responsible for the initial conflict would be held accountable. Number 2. A ban on anti-Japanese activities conducted by the Communist Party, the Blue Shirt Society, and other resistance groups. And number 3. An agreement ensuring that no Chinese troops would be stationed east of the Yongting River. Concurrently, the Japanese army positioned their forces at strategic points in Wuqing, Fangcai, Wanping, and Changping, effectively encircling the city of Beiping and continuing their advance to the surrounding suburbs. Starting on July the 11th, the Japanese army began bombarding Wanping City and its surrounding areas with artillery, resulting in numerous casualties amongst the local population. Following the injury of regimental commander Zhu Jingwen, residents were evacuated to safer locations outside the city. The conflict then spread to Babaoshan, Zhangxindian, Langfang, Yangchun, and other areas, with the 29th Army being deployed to various locations to confront the enemy. The Japanese military also dispatched aircraft for reconnaissance and strafing missions, leading to some intermittent fighting. On July the 13th, Mao Zedong urged every Communist Party member and anti-Japanese revolutionary to be prepared to mobilize to the front line of the anti-Japanese war at any time. This was being dispatched from his headquarters in Yan'an. By July the 15th, a CCP representative presented the Communist Party Declaration on Cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. This was given to Chiang Kai-shek, proposing that this declaration serve as a political foundation for cooperation between the two parties and be publicly issued by the Kuomintang. Zhou Enlai, Qin Bengqian, and Lin Bochu continued negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek, Xiao Lizu, and Zhang Chong in Lushan. Although Chiang Kai-shek recognized the Shanxi-Gansu-Ningxia border region, disagreements remained regarding the reorganization of the Red Army. On July the 16th, the Five Ministers' Conference in Tokyo resolved to mobilize 400,000 Japanese troops to invade China and to enforce a policy aimed at rapidly destroying the entire country. The following day, more than 100 Japanese soldiers arrived in Chunyi and Changping, where they reinforced fortifications on the city wall of Changping. On the 18th, the Japanese army invaded Changping, Tong Jojo, and other counties in the pseudo-border areas by maneuvering through various passes of the Great Wall. Japanese plainclothes teams were reported to be active in the Xiaotangshan area of Changping, raising alert levels within the Chinese army. On July the 20th, the Kuomintang Military and Political Department became aware that the Japanese army intended to first occupy strategic locations such as the Indigo Factory, Wanqiu Mountain, and Balichuang in the Pengxi area before cutting off the Pingshui Road and controlling the route from Beiping to Chongping. On the 21st, the Japanese army violated the agreement by bombarding Wanping County and the garrison at Zhongxingtuan. On the night of the 25th, a confrontation took place at the railway station in Langpang, located between Beiping and Tianjin. The clash involved Chinese troops and a Japanese company dispatched to repair some telegraph lines. General Kazuki promptly sought Tokyo's permission to respond with military force, believing that the situation required immediate action. Without waiting for authorization, he ordered a regiment from Tianjin to engage the Chinese forces and issued an ultimatum to Song Chi-yuan, stating that if the 37th Division did not completely withdraw from the Beiping area by noon on July the 28th, the garrison army would take unilateral action. The 77th Infantry Regiment of the 20th Division was dispatched from the Gonoi Squadron to escort the repair team to Langpang Station. Stationed near Langpang were the headquarters of the 113th Brigade of the 38th Division, along with the main force of the 226th Regiment, led by Brigade Commander Liu Jiansan and Regimental Commander Tu Jianlun. Although the leadership of the 29th Army adopted a passive stance in the War of Resistance, as the Chinese were calling it, the forces in Langpang prepared for a conflict in an organized manner. They not only evacuated the families of servicemen and relocated their regimental headquarters, but they also built fortifications and deployed plainclothes teams at Wanzhuang Station, Luofao Station, and Langfang Station to swiftly destroy the railway if necessary. Despite all of their preparations, the commanders of the 38th Division adhered to Song Chi-yuan's directives. When the 5th Company stationed at Yangtun observed Japanese supply units continuously moving towards the Legao Bridge, they sought permission to engage said enemy. However, the 38th Division later reassigned the company. The Bakni Line, established after the Boxer Protocol, had granted the Japanese the right to station troops, placing the 38th Division in a very vulnerable position and preventing them from stopping Japanese forces before they reached Langfang. Upon the arrival of the said Japanese forces at the Langfang Station, Chinese guards initiated negotiations requesting the Japanese withdraw quickly after completing their mission. The Japanese, however, insisted on establishing camps just outside the station, leading to repeated arguments. As tensions mounted, the Japanese began constructing positions near the station, ultimately forcing Chinese troops to retreat, and greatly escalated the conflict. The situation reached a boiling point at about 11:10 p.m. when fierce gunfire and explosions erupted near Langpang Station. The Japanese army claimed that they were defending the station from an attack by Chinese forces armed with rifles, machine guns, and mortars throughout the night. But according to Tu Jianlun, the head of the 226th Regiment, it was the 9th and 10th Companies that could no longer tolerate the Japanese provocations and fired first, catching the enemy off guard. As the battle intensified, reinforcements from the main force of the 77th Infantry Regiment, or the Lidong Unit, arrived at the scene after receiving reports of the skirmish and gradually joined the fight at about 6:30 a.m. on the 26th. When dawn broke, Japanese troops stationed at Langfang began to rush out and counterattack, seeing their reinforcements arrive. Recognizing they could not eliminate the Japanese presence at the station quickly, the 226th Regiment faced heavy bombardment from the Japanese Air Force later that morning. Consequently, the headquarters of the 113th Brigade and the primary forces of the 226th Regiment hastily retreated to Tongbei Town, suffering significant losses in equipment during their withdrawal. That night, Kazuki made the unilateral decision to abandon the policy of restraint, and he decided to use force on the 28th to, quote, punish the Chinese troops in the Beiping-Tianjin area. On the morning of the 27th, the High Army Command endorsed his decision and submitted a plan to the cabinet for mobilizing divisions in Japan. The cabinet agreed and imperial approval was sought. At that time, the Chinese army was gathering in significant numbers in Baoding and Shijiazhuang, which is in southern Hubei, as well as Datong, Shanxi. They effectively surrendered the Japanese army on all sides of the Fengtai district. Meanwhile, newly mobilized units of the Kwangtung Army and the Japanese Korean Army were en route to Tianjin and Beiping areas. The 2nd Battalion of the 2nd China Garrison Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major Hirobe, was dispatched with 26 trucks to the Japanese barracks within the walls of Beiping to ensure the protection of Japanese residents. Now, prior discussions had taken place between Takuro Matsue, the head of the Special Service Agency, and officials from the Hubei Chahar Political Council regarding the passage of troops through the Guangamen Gate just outside Beiping. The mayor, Chin Du-chun, had granted approval for this movement. However, when Major Tokotaro Sakurai, a military and political advisor to the council, arrived at the Guangamen Gate, which is, of course, a very famous gate to Beiping, at around 6 p.m., to establish contact, he found that the Chinese troops on guard had closed the gate. After further negotiations, the gates were opened at about 7:30 p.m., allowing the Japanese units to begin passing through. Unfortunately, as the first 3 trucks crossed, the Chinese opened fire upon them. 2/3 of the unit managed to get through before the gate was abruptly shut, leaving a portion of Hirobe's troops trapped both inside and outside. As they faced unexpected heavy fire from machine guns and grenades, efforts by Japanese and Chinese advisors to pacify the Chinese troops proved futile. By 8 p.m., the Japanese launched a counterattack from both sides of the gate. The Chinese received reinforcements and encircled the Japanese forces. Despite a relief column being dispatched by Brigadier Masakazu Kawabe, commander of the brigade in the Fengtai district, by 9:30 p.m., negotiations with the Chinese yielded a proposal for de-escalation. The Chinese army would maintain a distance while the Japanese inside the gate would relocate to the grounds of their legation, and those outside would return to Fengtai. Fighting ceased shortly after about 10 p.m., and approximately 2 a.m. the following day, Hirobe's units successfully entered the barracks in their legation. The total casualties reported for the Japanese army during these confrontations were about 2 dead and 17 wounded. Both fatalities were superior privates. The wounded included 1 major, 1 captain, a sergeant, 2 superior privates, 1 private first class, 7 privates second class, 2 additional civilians, and a news reporter. Additionally, the interpreter accompanying Tokotaro Sakurai had been killed in said action. On the 27th, the Japanese army launched attacks on the 29th Army garrisons in Tongshan, Tuanhe, Xiaotangshan, and other locations, forcing the defenders to retreat to Nanyuan and Beiyuan. At 8 a.m. on the 28th, under the command of Army Commander Kiyoshi Kozuki, the Japanese army initiated a general assault upon the 29th Army in the Beiping area. The primary attacking force was the 20th Division, supported by aircraft and artillery. They target the 29th Army Special Brigade, the 114th Brigade of the 38th Division, and the 9th Cavalry Division stationed in Nanyuan. Completely overwhelmed by the Japanese assault, Nanyuan's defenders struggled to maintain command, leading to chaotic individual combat. Meanwhile, the main Japanese garrison brigade in Fengtai advanced to Dahongmen, effectively cutting off Nanyuan's troops' route to the city and blocking their retreat. The battle for Nanyuan concluded at about 1 p.m., resulting in the deaths of Tong Ling, deputy commander of the 29th Army, and Zhao Dongyu, the commander of the 132nd Division. As this unfolded, elements of the 37th Division of the 29th Army launched an attack on the Japanese forces in Fengtai, but they were repulsed by Japanese reinforcements. On that day, the Japanese Army's 1st Independent Mixed Brigade captured Qinghe Town, prompting the 2nd Brigade of the Hubei Northern Security Force stationed there to retreat to Huangqi. The Japanese also occupied Xiahe. In the afternoon of the 28th, Song Chi-yuan appointed Zhang Xizhong as the acting chairman of the Hubei Chahar Political Affairs Committee and the director of the Hubei Chahar Pacification Office, as well as the mayor of Beiping, before leaving the city for Baoding that evening. The 37th Division was ordered to retreat to Baoding as well. On July the 29th, a significant mutiny broke out at Tong Jojo. If you remember our episode covering the Tonggu Truce, Tong Jojo had become the capital of the East Hubei Anti-Communist Autonomous Government, headed by Yin Zhukang. In response, Chiang Kai-shek had established the East Hubei Administrative Affairs Committee, chaired by Song Chen-yuan. In Tong Jojo, Japanese troops were stationed under the pretext of protecting Japanese residents, as stipulated by the Boxer Protocol. Initially, a unit was intended to be stationed in Tong Jojo. However, Vice Minister of the Army, Emizu Yoshijiro, strongly opposed this plan, arguing that placing forces within Tong Jojo, far from the Beiping-Tianjin line, was inconsistent with the spirit of the Boxer Protocol. Consequently, this unit was stationed instead in Fengcai, located southwest of Beiping. At the time of the Tong Jojo incident, the main force of the Japanese 2nd Regiment, which was responsible for defending Tong Jojo, had been deployed to Nanyuan, south of Beiping. Consequently, only non-combatant personnel remained in Tong Jojo. What was in Tong Jojo was the Chinese-led Zhejiang Anti-Communist Autonomous Government Security Force, whom Japan considered a friendly ally. Back on July the 27th, the primary forces of the Japanese Army stationed in Tong Jojo, comprising the Kayashima Unit and the Koyama Artillery Unit, received orders to advance towards Nanyuan, Beiping, leaving Tong Jojo significantly underdefended. The following day, the Japanese launched a substantial attack on Nanyuan, employing aircraft to bomb Beiping as well. Sensing a critical opportunity, Zhang Qingyu conferred with Zhang Yanzan and Shen Huangyan to initiate an uprising that very night. The insurgent force included elements from the 1st and 2nd Corps, alongside the Teaching Corps, totaling approximately 4,000 personnel. Zhang Qingyu orchestrated the uprising with a focused strategy. The 1st Corps was divided into 3 groups, targeting Japanese forces in Xitang, the puppet government, and various establishments such as opium dens, casinos, and brothels operated by the Japanese Ronin. Meanwhile, the 2nd Corps secured key intersections and facilities in Zhongguan, and the Teaching Corps managed defenses against the potential reinforcements at vital stations. At dawn on July the 29th, gunfire signaled the uprising eruption. The 2nd Unit of the 1st Corps launched an assault on the Xitang barracks, which housed 120 troops and non-combatant personnel, including the Tong Jojo Guard, Yamada Motor Vehicle Unit, a military police department, and a host of military and police units totaling about 500 individuals. At around 3 a.m. on July 29th, the sound of gunfire filled the air as the insurgents engaged the Japanese forces. Although equipped with only 4 field guns, several mortars, and a few heavy machine guns, the uprising's numerical superiority enabled simultaneous attacks from the east, south, and northwest. Despite their well-fortified positions and rigorous defense, the Japanese troops struggled against the relentless onslaught. For over 6 hours, fierce fighting would ensue. The uprising troops escalated their firepower, but they still failed to breach the Xitang barracks initially. More than 200 members of the Japanese security forces would lose their lives in the conflict. Concerned that reinforcements might arrive and flank the uprising, Zhang Qingyu ordered artillery assaults at around 11 a.m., prompting a shift in the battle's dynamics. The artillery targeted a Japanese motor vehicle company transporting supplies and munitions, leading to the destruction of all 17 vehicles, triggering explosions that scattered bullets and shrapnel across the area. Subsequently, nearby fuel depots ignited, engulfing the surroundings in flames and creating chaos amongst the Japanese ranks. The insurgent infantry capitalized on this confusion, wiping out most of the remaining Japanese forces with only a handful managing to escape. As the uprising signal rang out, another faction of insurgents swiftly blocked access to Tong Jojo, disrupting traffic and occupying the telecommunications bureau and radio station. They encircled the offices of the Zhejiang puppet government, capturing a trader named Yin Rugang, who was taken to the Beiguan Lusu temple. Despite being urged to resist the Japanese, Yin hesitated and was subsequently imprisoned. The 3rd group then targeted the Japanese Secret Service Agency in Nishijiang. Hosoki Shigeru, residing a mere lane away from the pseudo office, responded to the gunfire by mobilizing a contingent of secret agents to confront the uprising. However, the insurgents swiftly overtook the Secret Service Agency, resulting in Shigeru's death and the annihilation of all secret personnel. At 4 p.m. on July the 29th, the Japanese command dispatched reinforcements, compelling the insurgents to retreat from Tong Jojo. The Japanese-Chinese garrison ordered air attacks on the uprising forces, with over 10 bombers targeting Tong Jojo. Concurrently, the Japanese Fengcai Infantry Brigade and the 2nd Regiment were mobilized for a rescue operation, arriving on the morning of the 30th. The Japanese headquarters issued a night defense order requiring all units to be at high alert. By 5:30 p.m., commanding officers assembled to devise a strategy. With the uprising forces still positioned around the eastern, southern, and northern walls of the barracks, Tsujimura's troops implemented strict measures. All units were instructed to fortify defenses throughout the night, with the Tong Jojo Guard directly protecting the barracks of the Yamada unit, securing the warehouse and supplying areas. They enforced silence, prohibited any lights at night, coordinated operations under the codename Plum Cherry. As the Japanese planes repeatedly bombed the area, the insurgents, lacking anti-aircraft defenses, could only mount futile counterattacks with machine guns, leading to disorder amongst their ranks. Many insurgents abandoned their uniforms and weapons and simply fled, prompting Zhang Qingyu to make the difficult decision to evacuate Tong Jojo before Japanese reinforcements arrived, and they would regroup in Beiping with the remnants of the 29th Army. In the late hours of July the 29th, the security team retreated to Beiping in two groups. Upon arrival, they discovered the 29th Army had already evacuated, forcing them to further retreat to Changxingyan and Baoding. En route, they encountered part of the Suzuki Brigade of the Japanese Kwangtung Army near Beiyuan and Shijimen, where they faced concentrated attacks. Officers Shen Weigan and Zhang Hanming were both killed in subsequent battles as they led their teams in desperate fights for survival. Amidst all this confusion, Yin Rugang managed to escape when his convoy was broken up by some Japanese forces. In a last-ditch effort, Zhang Qingyu ordered the army to split into small groups of 50 and 60, navigating through Mengtogo to regroup with the 29th Army. By the time they reached Baoding, there were about half the forces that had started. On the morning of July the 30th, over 1,000 troops from the Sekai Army entered Tongzhou City. They rounded up all the men they encountered, searching residents for insurgents, and exhibited intentions of massacring the local population. By 4 p.m., the Kayashima Army arrived and sealed all the city gates, deploying surveillance units to oversee the city and restore public order. The Tsuchimura Army removed perimeter defenses and concentrated their forces in the barracks and storage facilities. Japanese troops combed through residences based on household registries, detaining those they deemed suspicious, with many later becoming executed. As reported by the puppet county magistrate Wang Jijiang, roughly 700 to 800 individuals were executed within a few days. This brutal retaliation instilled terror throughout Tongzhou City, leading many to flee and seek refuge, often in American churches. The pervasive atmosphere of fear lasted for 2 to 3 months. The Japanese authorities framed their violent suppression as restoring stability in East Asia, and derided the legitimate resistance of Chinese citizens as communist harassment and treason. Now, in response to the uprising, the Japanese embassy, concerned that it could trigger a repeat of an incident that had happened not too long ago known as the Temple Street Incident, and instigate some political upheaval at home, acted without government instructions. They appointed Morishima Morito to oversee negotiations with Chi Zongmo, who had replaced Yin Rugang as the head of the Hubei Anti-Communist Autonomous Government. Later on December the 24th of 1937, Chi would submit a formal apology to the Japanese embassy, committing to pay a total of 1.2 million yuan in reparations, with an immediate payment of 400,000 yuan, while the remaining 800,000 yuan would be disbursed by the Provisional Government of the Republic of China. Furthermore, the Japanese demanded that the Hubei Anti-Communist Autonomous Government relinquish the territories where Japanese nationals had been killed and take responsibility for constructing comfort towers. They compelled Chinese laborers to build these structures at the former site of the governor's office of canal transport in Shuyuan, Hutong, Nanmenli, and the northeastern corner of the Xitang Square to commemorate Japanese casualties from the uprising. Additionally, they forcibly uprooted ancient trees from the Temple of Heaven, transplanting them around the comfort towers. The Japanese military also demolished white marble guardrails at the Confucian Temple to erect a monument honoring their soldiers, resulting in the destruction of centuries-old cultural artifacts. And yeah, it's pretty messed up. On the morning of July 29th, the Japanese Army's 11th Independent Mixed Brigade attacked Beiyuan and Huangxi. The Hubei Northern Security Force, stationed in Huangxi, engaged the Japanese forces until about 6 p.m. before retreating. Meanwhile, the 39th Independent Brigade, garrisoned in Beiyuan, fought the Japanese before withdrawing to Guchang, eventually returning to Beiyuan. On July the 31st, this brigade was disarmed by the Japanese Army, while the independent 27th Brigade in the city was reorganized into a security team to maintain public order, later breaking through the Chahar province a few days later, and was reassigned to the 143rd Division. Meanwhile, the 38th Division of the 29th Army, stationed in Tianjin, proactively attacked the Japanese troops in Tianjin early on July the 29th, capturing the Japanese garrison in the Tianjin General Station, and launched an assault on the Japanese headquarters at the Haguang Temple and the Dongjuji Airport. Initially, the battle progressed favorably for the Chinese. However, due to counterattacks from Japanese aircraft and artillery, the Chinese forces began to retreat around 3 p.m., leading to the fall of Tianjin. Late in that afternoon, the rebel forces evacuated Tong County and advanced towards Beiping. En route, they were attacked by the Japanese army north of the city and subsequently retreated to Baoding. As the 37th Division of the 29th Army received orders to retreat southward, the 110th Brigade covered the army headquarters and the Beiping troops from Wanping to Babaoshan, eventually retreating southwards through Mengtogo. After completing their task, they withdrew to Baoding on July the 30th. By the end of the 30th, the Japanese army had occupied both Beiping and Tianjin. The Japanese Independent Mixed Brigade No. 1 and the Garrison Brigade occupied high ground west of Changxinjiang and near the area of Dahuichang on the evenings of the 30th and 31st, respectively. And with that, the battles in Beiping and Tianjin effectively came to a close. China and Japan were officially at war. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and you can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all my content, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Thus, it has finally happened. China and Japan are officially at war. From 1931 until now, it's been an unofficial war between the two. Yet another incident had finally broke the camel's back. There was no turning back as Japan would unleash horror upon the Chinese people. The fight for China's survival had just begun. China was completely alone against a fierce enemy. How would she manage?